for coming here. It's interesting testimony. I'd particularly like to thank Dr. Carafano and General Barno for your service to the country. General Barno, I particularly appreciate your comments about the sacrifice of the members of our military. And really, before I start my questions, I'd like to acknowledge somebody who's in the audience. Out of sheer coincidence, Michael Johnson from Mayville, Wisconsin, no relationship to me at all, was scheduled to be an intern in my office. And I had the honor of joining Michael and his brother Matt and sister Emily and their Andrew and Laura, his parents, as they laid their son, First Lieutenant David Johnson, to Western Arlington on February 22nd. So it goes way beyond the sacrifice of the individual military members. It is the sacrifice of the families, and they pay a very heavy price. So, Michael, if you just want to stand up and be acknowledged. Thank you. But let me first say, Dr. Carafano, you mentioned principles. I think that's extremely important in any budget. I think you need to establish principles and priorities. And I guess I'd like to ask all the witnesses, first of all, in terms of budget priorities, where would you place defense spending? Dr. O'Hanlon.
Thank you, Senator. At the top, not necessarily the only one at the top, though. Senator Conrad said it is the preeminent obligation of the U.S. government. I think it is certainly among the top 2 or 3. I certainly think taking care of the infirm, I certainly think educating the next generation of Americans would be comparably important to me, and then making sure that our fiscal health is such that future generations can still aspire to the American dream. I don't put those too far behind national defense,
okay.
but I'm willing to see a lot of adjustments in a lot of the programs because I think they've gotten out of control.
Okay, General Barno.
Yeah, I think it's the preeminent responsibility of the government. I would agree with that. And if that goes away, nothing else can follow. So it's the most important aspect of our government spending. How we do that, of course, is the ultimate question on sorting out our resources.
Dr. Carafano.
The Constitution does say provide for the common defense. It also says gives other, fair enough, it does give other requirements of government. But if you actually, in the Constitution, there are more enumerated powers on defense for the Congress and the President than any single other responsibility. So I think it is very difficult to argue anything other than that defense is the top priority. And if I could submit another document for the record, in our paper on analyzing the budget, we do make the argument, and we've got a chart in there which argues that defense becomes, by 2017, the last priority of federal government. So entitlements is higher, other discretionary spending is higher. The deficit in 2017 becomes bigger than the defense budget, and in comparison to everything else the Americans are spending money on, the defense will be their last priority.
Okay, well, let me just ask, does either of you or any of you disagree with basically Joint Chief of Staff Admiral Mullen's comment about the debt being a number one security threat? And then Secretary Clinton also said it's the most significant threat, or the most significant threat to our national security is our debt. I mean, anybody disagree with that?
Senator, I think it's one of the top couple of threats. I'm not sure I would make it the most important threat to our national security, looking at the dangerous world we're living in, but it's certainly in the top 2 or top 3.
Well, it's right up there. Anybody disagree with the fact that our long-term budget deficits and debt is really being driven by Social Security and Medicare, those entitlement programs?
I would add the tax code, which I think is in poor shape, but I agree with you otherwise.
Okay. Then let me go right to the, I guess, $64 question. Certainly, I'm trying to look at the big picture here. And this is the 4th year that President Obama has put forward a budget. I'm highly disappointed that in 4 years, 4 cracks at the apple here, this President has failed to lead by putting any proposal on the table whatsoever to reform Social Security and Medicare. I mean, do you agree with that? Is that something that you would expect out of the President of the United States after 4 years to put forward a proposal to address the long-term debt and deficits? Dr. O'Hanlon.
If you don't mind, I'll take a step back from the political answer, but simply say I only support additional defense cuts if they are accompanied by broad deficit reduction, including reform of entitlements, including cuts to entitlements. Because I think that for me, as a foreign policy strategist, the case for defense cuts is not that they're good in and of themselves. It's they're a necessary part of comprehensive sacrifice across the country so our economy becomes stronger over time so we can stay a great power. That won't happen unless entitlements are reformed as well.
Well, again, the practical matter of actually doing entitlement reform, doesn't it require presidential leadership? Have you ever, I've been watching this a long time. Have you ever seen anything that large, that significant, reformed without presidential leadership?
I'll just say I agree and pass over to Jay.
Dr. Carafano.
Yeah, I would, this to me raises a concern is that in many ways we're repeating the mistakes of the 1990s. When there was a tremendous emphasis on balancing budget in the 1990s, essentially what we did is we took deep cuts in the defense budget. We did nothing on entitlement reform, and we did very marginal things to slow the growth of other discretionary spending. It was kind of like a heroin fix. It felt good at the time, but it's an ephemeral. And essentially, if you look at what's been done in terms of debt reduction in the 5-year plan, it's very deep cuts in defense, marginal things in other discretionary spending, and nothing to do with the big bear in the room.
Well, I asked Secretary of Defense Panetta, why is it that it seems like, he disagreed with this, but I think it's true, that President Obama and his friends on the other side of the aisle always go to defense first. I mean, would you kind of agree that's basically their outlook? When you start cutting budgets, you're going to first go to defense?
Well, it is the largest part of still of discretionary spending, and particularly it's been very confusing for Americans to really understand what defense dollars are being spent on, because we relied on OCO, Operation Contingency Funding, so long, and the line between what's in the OCO, what is war cost, what's the base cost, has been so confusing. We've kind of created this impression that somehow there's a huge war savings to be had, when in many cases OCO funding was funding baseline operations. And in other cases, you weren't funding core things. You were deferring funding on core things. So the notion that somehow there's a huge war savings to be gained that could be invested elsewhere in federal spending is really kind of a Ponzi scheme.
Let me just this is a broad question, and I'd like to have all of you quick answer it. What is the #1 impediment to intelligent, efficient military spending?
I think my answer to that actually would be bureaucracy. We haven't talked too much about headquarters and headquarters overhead today, but the Defense Department, as it looks at its budget, is constrained by all manner of bureaucratic obstacles, some legislative obstacles, policies and process that have got it, really fenced in terms of how it can spend those dollars. I think there would be significant savings found if we were able to reform a good bit of that, and part of that, perhaps we can talk about later, is in headquarters.
I mean, I would say Congress. I mean, look, the National Defense Authorization Act has gotten longer and longer every year, and now it's as thick as a Bible. And there's a direct correlation: is the longer the act gets, the more inefficient DoD gets. And I think there's something to this. We've tried to micromanage, in a sense, rather than doing good business practices of giving people clear guidance and holding them accountable. And I think that would be a much more successful approach for the Congress to take.
Senator, I'd simply say that while I don't disagree with my colleagues, I also think we need to remember we're not doing too bad of a job with our national defense. I think the military establishment's been remarkable. It learned in 2 wars how to improve tactics that were initially not working. And the broader point for me here, and I say this to my fellow Democrats as well as Republicans all the time, is that yes, there's still fat in the Department of Defense, but it's not easy to identify and excise. It's marbled into the muscle. It's part of the way we do business, and it's therefore hard to reform it out. So you're not going to be able to say, let's just adopt these 3 things and we can cut the defense budget by $200 billion over 10 years. If you cut by those kind of numbers, you're going to have to cut capability too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.